Hello, everyone. I'm Mark Sachs, Southeast Director for ELNET US, and I'd like to welcome you to ELNET's Monday briefing. I often say this, but it has the advantage of being true. Today, we have a terrific guest, but also a sobering topic for conversation. Alex Hearn is the co-director of Labor Against Anti-Semitism and an investigative journalist who has appeared on the BBC, Sky News, Times Radio, and other outlets, and he's been published in The Independent, Free Press, one of my favorites, Daily Mirror, the Jewish News Syndicate, and many others. His investigative work has exposed anti-Semitism in the UK's National Health Service, Labour Party anti-Semitism, neo-Nazi infiltration of Reform Party, and far-right paramilitary training. He's also lectured at the European Parliament, the House of Lords, Holocaust Education Trust, and universities across Europe. As you can guess from the title of today's briefing, we are going to discuss the disturbing rise of anti-Semitism in the UK and the failure of the political class to do anything about it. Before I turn to Alex, I'd like to frame this discussion by starting with one of my favorite aphorisms. You can't cure stupid. Every conspiracy theory or fantastic allegation that defies belief, and in a recent case defies canine biology, IQ drops significantly. We are living in a world where the marketplace of ideas is no longer centered around the best and the brightest in pursuit of enlightenment and advancement. It's a marketplace being dominated and undermined by trolls and troglodytes, willfully sacrificing integrity and truth in pursuit of clicks, monetization, and influence, and in service of the most vile and rapacious ideologies. Tolerance is treated as the gateway to domination. Differences are signs of opposition worthy of defeat. Win-win has given way to zero-sum. And as this discussion will explore, anti-Semitism, and we all know this, the current drug of choice to amp up a restless populace, is always the first sign that society is banging up against its guardrails. As discouraging a place as this marketplace may be, we cannot abandon it. Tolerance, but not unfettered tolerance, the equal application of the rule of law, intellectual honesty and fairness, freedom of speech, religion, and association, but also freedom from harassment and terrorism. These are principles that not only keep Jews safe, but keep democratic societies democratic. ELNET's work in the areas of diplomacy, defense and security, and economic cooperation between Israel and Europe are predicated on these principles. Our work with political and policy influencers like Lord Walney, with whom I spoke last week, or Alex Hearn, to whom I'm going to turn in just a moment, and the nearly 600 others like them from 26 European countries who participated on our delegations over the past few years, are evidence that we are in that marketplace of ideas, making our case and positioning ourselves to win. We're not alone, despite how sometimes it feels that way. This is why we hold these briefings every Monday, so you are informed, that you are assured of our principles and our work, and that you too can participate in that marketplace of ideas. I say this each time I host this briefing. We can't and we couldn't do this without your support. So thank you to those of you who invest in our principles and our work. If you want to learn more, if you want to do more, if you want to contribute more, visit elnetus.org. Thank you for listening. And Alex, welcome. It's a real pleasure to have you with us today. Before we jump into kind of the topic of conversation today, I'd love to get your thoughts as a Brit going through, much of what I was recently, or just discussing what your thoughts are on what I just said.
It's genuinely disturbing what's been happening in the UK. I think it took people by surprise that the speed of it and the depth of it. That in the UK we believed that we were immunized from what we'd seen on the continent, the anti-Semitism, the political violence as well that you see in Europe and sometimes and the States as well. And we are not immune to any of that. That's what we've learned. And British tolerance doesn't really exist for the Jewish community. It may exist for other people. It sure as hell doesn't exist for us. So the Britain that we knew has, to a large degree, disappeared. We've got children who have to have safety briefings, and a friend told me today that their kindergarten age child sort of thought it was a game, hiding. Where do you hide? I hide in the closet, and they didn't actually get that it was real. We have worshippers behind airport style security. Even our solidarity rally had to be behind airport style security with metal detectors and bag searches. No other community has to go through that. And there are societal and institutional reasons for that. And it's genuinely alarming. I believe that you had someone on recently who talked about an inflection point with Britain, and it is genuinely alarming when you look at the cumulative effect rather than incident by incident. I can go through it now, or I can go through this later.
Yeah, let's just hold off a second because you just referenced Lord Walney, whom I mentioned at the beginning in my remarks, and I want to start with something that I asked him, and you're sort of going in that direction. So let's pivot there first, and I'm going to rephrase what I said to him. I'm going to use Newton's first law because I think it is one of the most apt way to describe human nature and also geopolitics. And it's essentially an object in motion tends to stay in motion until acted upon by an opposite force. Right now, we are seeing the left, particularly the Red Green Alliance in the UK, with incredible momentum, incredible inertia, plowing ahead. And the question I had asked Lord Walney, and he said his response was that inflection point was, it seems that this will go really one of two, it can only go one of two directions. It will continue to plow forward, or it will be met by an alternative or an opposite force. And I happened to see over the weekend images of I forgot what it was called. The Unite the Kingdom rally. And everybody looked at it with a different perspective, but that got me thinking, an opposite force is brewing. What are your thoughts on where this goes? And as someone who deals with anti-Semitism in the UK, where do you see progress being made, and how difficult will it be to create that opposite force?
Right, so actually, there's one part that's missing from that, and that's the right. The extreme right, the real hardcore extreme right. So the right works in shades. I don't think people really understand that. They understand that on the left, you've got Stalinists and Trotskyites and Leninists and all these kind of shades, but you have the same on the right. And the extreme right have anti-Zionism as a significant force within them, and they are true believers in the anti-Semitism. Of course they are. So it's not just the Red Green Alliance. You have neo-Nazis appearing on Islamist podcasts, for example. You have people on the left going to neo-Nazi meetings. So it's not just the Red Green Alliance. And then you've got the kind of institutional stuff. We've got Vote Gaza MPs elected on a single issue, and they operate within Westminster while drawing legitimacy from this kind of political ecosystem that treats Jewish communal life as inherently suspect or even evil. Then you've got these kind of famous policing failures with the weekly hate marches where they arrest Jews instead of the racists, where they are basically managing the comfort of protesters rather than protecting the communities being intimidated. And there's lots of reasons for that. You've got state prosecution failures too, where if you're Jewish, you're at least half as likely to see a prosecution as a Muslim. You've got the charity sector, where organizations with links to prescribed groups operate under the regulatory radar. Then you've got the BBC, which I won't say any more about. I'm sure everyone knows all the problems there. The university sector, where Zionist-free zones have to be challenged by external legal intervention rather than defended by the institutions themselves. And then finally, you've got the cultural sector, where the Red-Green Alliance, as you put it, has become this default moral framework, making it really dangerous, either for artists or students or professors. It becomes dangerous to dissent professionally or for your student life. So in the UK, we have been entertaining Islamist extremism for years, which the Middle East stopped tolerating long ago. You know, the Abraham Accords were countries who exported Islamist ideology, and then they realized that for reasons of national survival, that it needed to be stopped and crushed. And meanwhile, Britain has been moving in the very opposite direction. We've got these kind of people waving placards of Ayatollah Khomeini saying be on the right side of history. What happened in the UK after October the 7th, as it happened in a lot of places, but really strongly in the UK, Hamas filmed themselves to send a message to the world. And that message was to attack Jews. And in the UK, it really worked. The taboo was completely broken and it really excited people. And attacks against Jews spiked massively straight away. They were celebratory and it completely shifted the Overton window. So what erupted before Israel even responded was not anger at Israel, but excitement at the murder of Jews. So for us in the UK, October the 7th was a permission event. But here's where I push back slightly on this kind of binary frog in the boiling water kind of idea, which implies this passive unconscious slide. What actually happened is that since October the 7th, the temperature just became visible. The scale of it on the streets, in universities, in the charity sector, in politics, it shocked people. People who previously been able to look away, the Golders Green stabbing, the desecration of memorials, the open celebration of violence against Israelis. You know, one today was almost beaten to death in Golders Green. The report has just come out. And these things, they didn't create the problem. They made it impossible to maintain the polite fiction that the problem wasn't happening. You know, Jews in Golders Green have been constantly attacked for years. And that visibility has produced a counter reaction, which you mentioned, and it's genuine and growing, even if it's still horribly inadequate.
Yeah, you made a brilliant. Oh, go ahead. Finish your thought.
Oh, I was just going to say, Britain's very good at recognizing problems, but very bad at following through.
Well, I don't think Britain's alone in that. I say these to Americans all the time. The UK is probably a good decade or more ahead of us, but we have imported much of what you're dealing with. We're behind quite a bit. And I think you raised a brilliant point that is not often raised enough. October 8th was the gasket bursting, but it wouldn't have burst if the underlying forces weren't already there and they had been building for decades. And I think it was that explosion that is now forcing people to reconcile with the poor policies that brought us to where we are today. But it will always come to some sort of reckoning. How do we address the failures and how do we make sure that Jews particularly are protected in our communities?
Yeah, right. The Wolney review had 41 recommendations, I think. How many have been implemented? I'm not sure
Right.
that any have been, you know. So the pattern is one of institutional knowledge without institutional will. So what's the point of having the knowledge if you don't actually follow it up? So this kind of the idea of a fork in the road with submission between submission and resistance, if you like. Well, actually, it's a choice between two kinds of resistance. That's the fork. There's performative resistance, which is empty, and then there's actual resistance, which is structural. And British political systems and many more things have made it far more difficult to do this structural resistance.
So let's get into the political structure here, because the UK just had local elections about a week and a half ago. The Greens, so those on the left, won pretty big. Those on the right, Reform, won pretty big. Mainstream, I guess, let's call them, the Tories and Labour, kind of held their own at a very low level, if I understand correctly. It's not too dissimilar to what we just saw in Spain. Sort of the right, far left win, and the middle seems to get lost being just the middle, which decades ago or not too long ago might have seemed pragmatic and more universal in their thoughts, but we're seeing playing to the side. So let's break this down for everybody who doesn't live in the UK, the most simplest terms. Let's first start with, how do you define the UK, Britain, and England? How do we separate them? And you know, let's then look at their political systems because they're all slightly together but slightly different.
Right, and it's a really good question because most people here don't actually know the answer. So you know when you have those drop-down menus on the internet and it says ask you where you live and you have to find the place where you live. Well, people from here are desperately searching under different terms because we don't know where we live. So we search under G for Great Britain, U for United Kingdom, or sometimes E for England. So most people don't actually understand the difference themselves. So Great Britain is the island comprising of England, Scotland, and Wales, three countries in one landmass, of which England is the largest part, right? And
Mhm.
um, then you've got the United Kingdom, which is the political state, and it adds Northern Ireland to the three countries on the island of Great Britain. So you've got four countries governed under one sovereign state, one parliament at Westminster, and one monarch, of course. So England is a country within Britain. Britain is an island within the UK, and the UK is the actual sovereign state recognised in international law. Now, people often use England and Britain interchangeably, but doing so technically erases Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland from the picture, which the Scots and the Welsh in particular will tend to notice. um,
and and they have different political systems. They have their own parliaments, correct? That have a certain amount of sovereign responsibility.
so it's a hybrid system. It's not quite a federation, and it's not quite a unitary state. You've got the formal constitutional position is that the UK is a unitary state with sovereignty in the Westminster Parliament. But since devolution in the late 1990s, it functions in practice with significant federal characteristics. So Scotland has its own parliament with substantial legislative powers, including over health, education, and justice, and since 2016, tax powers. Wales has the Senate, which started with weaker powers but gradually acquired more. And England, oddly, has no devolved parliament of its own. It's governed directly by Westminster, which creates this asymmetry, sometimes called the West Lothian questions, where the West Lothian question, where Scottish MPs at Westminster can vote on English matters, but English MPs can't vote on devolved Scottish matters. And here's the kicker: England pays most of the bills economically for all these countries. So, on the question of voting for national parties, the main parties like Conservative, Labour, and the Liberal Democrats, they stand candidates across Great Britain, although not typically Northern Ireland, which has its own party system. But Scotland and Wales have significant nationalist parties. So you've got the SNP, the Scottish National Party in Scotland, and Plaid Cymru in Wales. And they contest both devolved and Westminster elections. The SNP dominated Scottish politics for years and nearly won the independence referendum in 2014 until they realised that they quite needed the rest of us. So while the UK-wide parties do compete everywhere, the political landscape in Scotland and Wales looks very different from England's, with national identity and the constitutional question playing a much bigger role.
And let's talk about the parties that are playing now in parliamentary UK politics. Um, or actually, why don't you give us before we move? Well, yeah, let's start with the parties, and then we'll talk about what happened in the recent election because I think that's important to understand. What are the main parties now that we should be watching that are vying for parliamentary control or influence in the UK?
Okay, so this is something that's changed quite dramatically very recently. We went from having two main parties, a two-party system, like you have in the States, to suddenly having a five-party system. So let's start with the Greens, because they're quite an interesting example. They're a left of Labour insurgent party for all intents and purposes, promoting open borders, decriminalisation of all drugs. They focus on cost of living and housing. And And their success is mainly fueled by disillusion over the Labour Party. So the Green Party are no longer a single issue party focused on the environment like they used to be. But their challenge is really translating that into parliamentary seats. And in recent years, they've actively been trying to lure Labour voters away using anti Zionism. So in 2018, the party declined to adopt the IHRA definition of anti Semitism and they supported BDS, the boycotting of Israel. So they entered the post October the 7th era with this internal culture where framing Israel in eliminationist terms carried minimal political costs. So by 2024, polls and reports showed Muslim voters who previously supported Labour were attracted to the Gaza stuff. So it's been consciously cultivated, like Mothin Ali, their deputy leader, who celebrated October the 7th, is this manifested. And since October the 7th, the party's made calculated decisions to compete for Muslim voter defections from Labour, which has given it lots of momentum. And they had a recent conference which saw a Zionism is racism motion, this kind of resurrecting this classic Soviet anti-Semitism. And then there's the leader, Zach Polanski, who kind of looks up to Mamdani. He's been caught lying about his job, his charity work, and even his place of residence. He's a populist, basically. So he's the mirror image of reforms. He'll say whatever he thinks people want to hear. And
he uses his Jewish heritage, I believe, as an excuse for some of the most, ridiculous positions. Let's just leave it at that.
Yeah, apparently we're all just imagining that we're under attack while we're being stabbed and shot in the streets. This is what people voted for. They had this entryism. It happened to the Labour Party. It's really important to understand that in 2025, the leadership election presented members with a choice between election-focused professionals versus insurgent activists. And Polanski won with 84.1% of the vote, which tells you about where the party's base has moved to, their activist base. Only about 30% of the membership voted, which is about 20,000 people. And 8,500 people joined during the campaign period to vote for Polanski. So what I'm saying is we saw entryism just as we did under Corbyn with Labour, and many of them were the same people. Many expelled for anti-Semitism were embraced by the Green Party. They didn't say, no, hold on, you were expelled for being anti-Semitic. They said, come in. So Polanski created the tone and the permission, and at his first annual conference in 2025, he called for a wealth tax, an end to arms sales to Israel, and framed his platform around calling out the genocide in Gaza. So that's Zach Polanski for you.
And then there's liberal Democrats, right? If we're moving from left, I guess, to right, liberal Democrats would fall in between of Greens and Labour?
Yes, so Ed Davey is the leader. He leads the third biggest party. He's a centrist liberal whose personal brand is built around caring and public services and localism. He leads a party that punches well above its vote share through geographic concentration. And that platform is broadly centre-left on social issues and pro-European. Voting for the Lib Dems is really a protest vote, I would say. Previous election success was built on anti-conservative voting in the south of England. And Ed Davey himself was noted for these attention-grabbing stunts like bungee jumping and paddle boarding and making a fool of himself. And it attracted praise and ridicule. But at the end of the day, it kept the party in the news cycle. So they've got these, they want to, their signature constitutional commitment is proportional representation, scrapping voter ID, lowering the voting age, and widening civic participation for settled EU citizens. And they're pretty good on the environment too. They really campaign hard on it, on visible environmental stuff like sewage in the rivers and the sea. And they position themselves as the most effective barrier to right-wing challengers, particularly reform. And in many southern seats, they're urging tactical voting where they're best placed to win.
And what's their position, or do they have a formal platform position on Israel? And what's been their stance on anti-Semitism in the UK?
It's not been great, if I'm honest. they've been a massive letdown on that side of things. When Ed Davies spoke at the Jewish Solidarity rally, there were howls of jeers and laughter because of the things that he said that have really incited hatred, I think. We know that most attacks statistically use Israel as the pretext for racist attacks. That's in the statistics. So when you say stuff like genocide or calling for this and calling for that, he's not a lawyer. He's not an international lawyer. And the government have said themselves that it's not a genocide. So when he's saying these things, it's felt as very hostile for the Jewish community and very irresponsible as well, I have to say. So no, he's not particularly friendly, although, he did go to the rally and he did face the music. So there's something to be said for that. Another politician.
Okay. And moving then to the right, right of the left, we have Labor, correct? So where's Labor it seems to be in the wilderness right now, and Starmer's position is on shaky ground.
Starmer's position is really shaky. A lot of people don't think he's going to last. The problem is twofold. There's immigration. The two things that occupy people's minds: the economy, right, as Bill Clinton said, I think it was, and immigration as well is not far behind. So Labour have been really bad on immigration, but then they got Shabana Mahmood in, and she's really tough. And because she's from a minority group herself, she can do things and it won't be seen in the same light. In terms of the economy, they don't want to raise tax. So what they're left doing is, it almost feels like they're just pulling different levers and seeing what happens. And stuff like raising national insurance and raising minimum wage. Well, any businessman could have told you that would have stopped them hiring more people. So how the government didn't know that is beyond me. There's certain things going on which people are losing trust in. So it's not looking good for Labour, not at all. Not in any department, I would say.
And if I get my numbers correct, I think that if Starmer is replaced, he will be the sixth prime minister in 10 years?
It's like a revolving door.
Yeah.
It was before this fragmentation, actually. It was happening to the Conservative Party before. So it points to this very much deeper issue, which I was going to get into later on. But I can talk about it now if you would like, try and explain this revolving door thing that you mentioned.
Sure. And then we'll come back to the Tories and reform after this part.
A lot of what we're seeing around the world, in my opinion, is because we're seeing the end of an era of unprecedented dominance by the West. People are having to come to terms with having less money and less influence worldwide, less power. So there's a lot of turmoil. For the first time, people are, seeing that their kids aren't going to do better than them. They're probably going to do worse. They're probably going to struggle more. So Europe and the West is finding its new place in the world. And will it be a new lower place or will it end in disaster? I don't know, because Europe's like a museum. That's its future. And of course, all this turmoil leads to a lot of anti-Semitism. It leads to a lot of unhappiness. But under the hood, nothing is being actually addressed. People just change leader and think, well, actually, we can make the economy better and we can do this and we can do that. No, we're living in a new world. We have emerging economies. We are a fallen empire. I mean, the anti-Semitism in the States is not at the same level, perhaps, because you haven't got this decline, which is unmanageable. You're still up there. But even just the idea that it might be the end with isolationism and seeing other emerging markets causes a lot of turmoil in itself. So that's why America isn't totally immune, but it's nothing compared to what Europe has experienced, coming to terms with the end, really. So unfortunately, there's not much that can be done about that at the moment.
There was an article I read in Politico EU, which talked The message essentially was you can change your prime minister, but you're not changing the problems.
Yeah.
And the problems are virtually no manufacturing left, no longer really producing energy, haven't rebounded from the financial crisis of 2008, looking a little bit more, resembling a little bit like Greece of,
Yeah.
I think, the last decade. I mean, it's got real fiscal and economic problems ahead of it, and replacing the prime minister doesn't necessarily solve that problem, but it looks like it's going down that path.
Look, we're not a trustworthy investment for the world anymore. The super rich don't come here, and people don't store their money here like they used to. And we used to be seen as a kind of a dead cert for money, right? For investment, and that's no longer the case. And there's reasons for that. There's good reasons for that.
So let's get back to the parties, because I think we'll probably end up revisiting some of those challenges in a little while. But let's talk about the Tories, led by Kemi Badenoch.
Right.
Where are the Tories right now, and how is Kemi viewed in kind of in the UK in terms of leadership?
Kemi is actually pretty popular, but the problem is the Tories are a party fighting a war on two fronts and losing ground on both of those fronts. So reform is eating them alive on the right, while the Lib Dems continue to hold these kind of affluent suburban seats, which they took in 2024. And Badenoch's response has been to go to the right, evident in her alternative King's speech, where she talked about scrapping the European Convention on Human Rights and things like that. And the issue is that it's almost identical territory to reforms, but without Farage's insurgent energy or outsider credibility. Um, Badenoch was reportedly named Santa Claus in Reform headquarters for the stream of gifts she kept delivering them, with MPs defecting. Tells you a lot. So the question
Yeah.
is there still space between Reform and the Lib Dem for the Tories? Her parliamentary debating skills are really, really fantastic, but the results are really concerning. So what she's doing is she's managing a decline. She's not reversing it.
And then that leaves us with Reform. Talk to us about Reform, their platform, and Nigel Farage.
Right, yes. So that's led by Trump's pal and engineer of Brexit, Nigel Farage, and it's a right-wing populist party. And what it's done is it's turned Farage's Brexit vehicle into something which is a genuinely disruptive electoral machine. Reform are like the populist mirror image of the Greens, but their thing is anti-immigration. So they're suffering similarly to the Greens, except the Greens kind of embrace it a lot more. But I did an expose about neo-Nazis trying to infiltrate Reform. And they were also inspired by what the hard left did in the Labour Party under Corbyn. So Reform are the right wing of the Conservative Party, which is why there's been so many defections from the right wing of the Conservative Party. And both the Greens and Reform have expanded so quickly that they can't vet their candidates properly. They just don't have the system, and Reform particularly. So I think of Reform as like a kind of British version of MAGA. But Farage, he's an odd one. He talks about the Jewish lobby and fantasizes about Soros being a threat to Christianity and and marking the end of Europe. But I would say that being anti-Jewish isn't his ideological worldview, unlike the Greens. It's not how he's his lens for seeing the whole world. And this is where he differs to those who are further to the right from his party. So reform is basically anger at immigration levels, at institutional failure, and at cultural change, which they don't like, changing social boundaries, that kind of stuff. So where the Greens are expanding leftward from environmentalism, reform is expanding rightward from Brexit. And both are feeding on the same underlying phenomenon, the collapse of trust in the two-party system.
What do the recent local elections portend for the parliamentary elections next year?
It's an interesting one. So some people think that the Tories were that they held their ground. but they lost significantly, just less dramatically than Labour and less visibly than they did in 2025. You've got this five-party story, two of which are insurgent, the Greens and Reform, and they are cannibalising the two traditional governing parties from different directions, while the Lib Dems quietly consolidate in the middle. And the question is, as you asked, what happens in a first past the post election? We always thought that we were structurally immune to this type of political fragmentation that we've seen in Europe, that proportional representation produces. But what we're seeing with this five-party system is the Europeanization of British politics, which is happening despite the electoral system. And it's this familiar pattern, right, where you mentioned it earlier, where the traditional centre gets squeezed. So if you replace the names, you could be describing France or Germany. But there's one really big difference. It's really significant to Europe. The British system is supposed to force voters into two broad coalitions, punishing fragmentation and producing clear governing majorities. So what's happening now is that voter behaviour is fragmented anyway, and the system that we've got just isn't built for it. It's struggling to contain it. So driving the fragmentation is essentially the same thing everywhere. The collapse of the post-war social contract between mainstream parties and their electorates. So you've got working class voters who feel abandoned by the Labour Party. And meanwhile, the Conservatives either chase populism and lose the suburbs or stay moderate and lose the base. So the critical difference is that Britain doesn't have any coalition building culture. So with no outright winner, there's few negotiations and power sharing agreements. What we'll have is permanent instability without that structure. And if the local elections are anything to go by, will be governed by fragmentation. But here's the kicker: fragmentation not as strength, but fragmentation as paralysis.
That's a despairing outlook, to be quite candid. And look, I think our founders created the electoral system for very similar reasons, to try to prevent faction. We are seeing the two-party system here too, kind of slowly devolve into internecine groups that are wielding power within or kind of taking power from within. Yeah, and as you are describing it, I still come back to my Newton's law of motion. There are no oblique angles here, meaning they are on a head-on collision. And at some point, one of the two is going to have to win. Otherwise, it will be perpetual stalemate and stagnation, as you just outlined. And it's not a comfortable future to see.
Yeah, I think we just a bit more flexible, don't we, in our thinking, and not say it has to either be this or it has to be that. You can have things where there's some kind of workaround. I think people need to think a bit more out of the box. We're living in a very different world now.
So I'm going to segue from what you said, because I'm also going to tie that into my next question. But I want to read something you wrote in the Free Press, which I thought was a very good article. And, your status just rose in my account now that you're in the Free Press. So kudos to you. You wrote, British Jews have watched sitting members of parliament attend marches characterized by racism and hate, where being visibly Jewish is deemed a provocation. You have watched as smashed windows of Jewish businesses are waved away in the pages of The Guardian as, quote, small acts of petty symbolism. They have seen an Israeli soccer team's fans banned from Birmingham over concocted charges of hooliganism. They have watched students at Britain's finest universities abuse Jewish professors and students, helping to create a culture where 1 in 5 British students said they would not house share with a Jew. They have watched parliamentary candidates campaign on Gaza, celebrating October 7th. They have watched synagogues implement airport-style security and their children required to undergo security briefings for kindergarten. Given what you just outlined, this collision course or stalemate between two opposing ideologies and ideas. Where do the Jews fall? What happens to the Jews? Does it get worse? Does it stay the same? Does one side have a positive influence? What happens?
I think Jewish people are desperately searching for safety in this country. And what's happening is some of them are running to the further right as a result of that, because some people are saying, we'll protect you. Some people with deeply problematic histories, as we saw with the rally, Tommy Robinson, we're talking about someone who almost wrecked a child grooming court case for clicks. He turned up at a traffic accident in Kensington, live streaming, declaring it a terrorist incident. He wrote The Jewish Question, defending Kanye West and saying that Jews controlled the media. If, as a Jew, you think that that person is going to keep you safe, you are wrong. But here we are with a small minority just so desperate that they're saying that's our guy, because he doesn't overtly hate us like the far right or the far left. And these other guys in the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, they aren't keeping us safe either. So actually, for the Jewish community, these are really, really worrying times, where people are just desperately looking to see who will keep us safe in this instability at the heart of British politics, which is symptoms of a deeper crisis.
So, as a co-director of the Labor Against Anti-Semitism, we talked about Lord Walney's prescriptions, that have not been taken up. What do you think are the most important steps that need to be enacted for anti-Semitism to be rebuffed, quieted down, suppressed? I'm not sure even the word to use for that, but how do you deal with the disease of anti-Semitism?
Well, there's so many things that can be done. And what I will say is that fragmentation causes paralysis. And to a degree, that is why we're here, as well as the kind of underlying issues of finding our new place in the world, which I spoke about. But when the Labour Party are looking to please everyone, including extremists, they please no one. And of course, Jews are left to hang out to dry. So there's lots of things that you can do. Whether they happen or not is a different question. But the first thing that I would say is there are existing laws. It was said for a long time that it wasn't possible, that they didn't exist, that they couldn't enforce them. And we knew it was nonsense. We cited the laws to them. And now the security threat in Britain, the terrorist threat, has gone up to severe. Suddenly, miraculously, these things can be enforced. We saw a far right march on a Muslim area in the East End, completely stopped, completely excluded from that whole region, from the whole borough, because they wanted to. And yet, people were allowed to march on a synagogue. So Jewish people look at that, and we know that the law is being enforced selectively. And these are just one of the things where you mentioned Greece. These are the characteristics of a failed state. People gathering around a police station to get someone out, the police having to de-arrest people. It's pathetic. They need to enforce the existing laws. The tools are there. They need to issue binding operational guidance to police, councils, regulators, and universities on applying the Equality Act, the Public Order Act, and the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, with personal accountability for failure. We need the Community Security Trust to protect Jews in this country, to go in and train police, to train judges, to be able to actually understand. There's so few Jews in the UK. There's like 250,000 of us. There's just such a lack of understanding as well. And the second place to start is to reform the Charity Commission. They need to create a dedicated counter-extremism unit to proactively investigate charities operating as fronts for incitement or extremism support, using powers and precedents that already exist. So what you'll find is that extremists often use charities. It's their way of gaming the system. I mean, it it's maddening that we know that the fatal flaw of democracy is people gaming the system. We learnt that in the 1930s. And yet here we are talking about Islamist extremists gaming the system in charities and places like that. We need to fix protest policing. We need to establish real-time reviews of the people who police the rallies. They're called gold commanders. We need to look at their decisions. We need to mandate publication of arrest data and insulate protest policing from political influence, which is what the Jewish community feel has been happening, that it's been politically influenced. We need to overhaul education, teach anti-Semitism as a living system of prejudice, not a historical event, and embed it across the curriculum, not confined to Holocaust Memorial Day, where you've got all these kind of competing grievance cultures squabbling and eradicating Jews from the whole story. We need to tackle institutional capture in universities and use existing Equality Act obligations to hold vice chancellors personally accountable for hostile environments and condition public funding on compliance. You hit people in the wallet, they'll listen. All of these people will listen. Regulate the NGO to media pipeline. Plays a big part in what I call epistemic capture, where there's this chain of self-verification, like the dog claim that you saw. That went from a Hamas NGO to a UN spokesperson to the New York Times. And it was in street protests in London. So there's this chain. And now if you look it up on AI, it cites that Hamas NGO as so the source of the claim becomes the proof of the claim, right? It's all just this self-verifying claim. So we need transparency on funding sources for organizations producing reports that shape public discourse, particularly around Israel or Jews, particularly Gulf and Iranian funding flowing through nominally independent bodies. We need to counter the genocide inversion. Government and institutions need to act actively and publicly to rebut the framing that equates Israel with Nazism, rather than treating it as legitimate political speech. There's a contemporary commission structure for anti-Semitism, and it does need to be named as such, in my opinion.
And not to state what I think is the obvious, but there are only 200, as you said, 1,000 plus Jews in the UK, a very small minority. Yet everything you just outlined has a direct impact on British citizens who are not Jewish. The vast majority of those living in the UK are not Jewish, and everything you just outlined has a direct impact on the future of their country. Where is the will? Jews aside, where is the will to address these issues that have a direct impact on the future of their children's future and grandchildren's future in their land of the UK, their homeland?
It doesn't exist, partly because of fragmentation. But what we saw in this rallies this weekend, and I'm surprised it hasn't happened more often, is that other extremist groups look at those weekly marches and they say, we want to be policed in that way. We demand that. We demand all those things that they're getting. And if we don't get them, it's going to kick off. So that's what we saw. We saw people demanding the same treatment, which has been sorely lacking. And people that I don't necessarily agree with on almost anything should still get the same treatment. It's really important, because then you're not actually running things in a proper way at all. You're selectively policing, you're selectively doing everything. And that doesn't, eventually, you're right, every citizen will suffer because of that.
Very simple, the equal application of the law. I do want to, we've got a few questions here. So let's start with, I think it's interesting, you referenced France earlier in the discussion, but we have a question if there's a way to define a difference or explain the difference between UK anti-Semitism, perhaps anti-Semitism in France. Do you see a difference in the way that it's adjudicated, whether it's performed, suppressed, enacted? Is there a difference?
There is a difference. Their Islamist anti-Semitism comes from a different community. It comes from a different history. They had the most amount of Jews in Europe. When I say that, it's there's something like a million, 1.35 million Jews living across the whole of Europe. I think
The
I
most.
mean
Yeah.
it's nothing. So the the extermination of Jews was a resounding success, right? Because it never recovered. So what we're talking about is these tiny, tiny populations. So when I say France has the biggest Jewish population in Europe, it's still not a lot of people. Um, and I don't know if you remember, there was a young girl who was raped because she was Jewish, a child.
Hmm.
Uh, people are killed because they are Jewish, and often in an Islamist setting. So France is specifically, because of their colonial history as well. It is a slightly different case for them. But all you have to look at is the amount of French speakers in Tel Aviv, and you know that there's been considerable movement, and it's been going on pre-October the 7th.
Yes, yes. What are the thoughts in the UK Jewish community? Thought I've heard plenty think about leaving, but what is actually happening on the ground?
Well, here's the thing about British people. We don't travel very well. And the UK Jewish community is we're British. We're like all the other British people. We like what we like. We don't speak any other languages. French Jews and Jews from other places in Europe, they'll speak Ivrit, no problem. They can go somewhere, they can adapt. British people just aren't that great at that. So we've been here a long time, and we've had a lot of stability. We've had a really good run. Um, so we're really loath to leave, but I have to tell you, every weekend at the dinner table, on a Friday night, we're thinking about where we're going to go, how we're going to go. Those of us with elderly parents and children are thinking about the timing of it, wondering, should we be more pessimistic? Because, the pessimists do survive. So those are the kind of conversations that we're having. When when we go to Jewish events, the location is held back until the very last moment. And often, when you've got children, you'll think, do you know what? Just one of us goes, just in case. And this isn't a conversation that just I have in my family. Actually, I said it to some people, and they said, you know what? We have exactly the same conversation. We've never actually talked about it, but people do often do this now, just in case. So your children don't end up as orphans if something happens. This is what we've been reduced to in the UK, in the tolerant UK.
Yeah. Another question I've got is you talked about the fragmentation in Parliament, no, not getting used to working together, coalition building, I should say. So
Mm.
this person wants, if you could expand that a little bit. Um, how bad does it need to get before coalitions become likely or possible? And do you foresee that? And do you foresee it on the right or the left more likely?
Britain doesn't change very easily or very well. It's not this kind of fast-paced changing environment. It's quite a traditional place. They don't like changing things up at all. So when I talked about adapting the environment, we live in this social media world where everything's siloed and people have these very different opinions and they don't hear the other opinions, and that's not helping either with our politics. Britain doesn't know who it is, where it's going, or how it might get there. I think you pointed this out. The economy broke in 2007. The European settlement broke in 2016, and the transatlantic relationship has been fraying for a decade now. As you said, six people have held the premiership in a decade, and twice in 6 years, voters have given a party a massive majority with an express demand to end the chaos, only for the chaos to return almost immediately. So this disease is that Britain is trying to run the two-party governing system, and the gap between what voters actually want and what the electoral system produces is now so wide that whoever sits in Downing Street inherits this mandate. Everyone talks about a mandate, but it doesn't really exist. And no amount of institutional insulation can protect a prime minister whose electoral coalition was never real in the first place. So, in the case of Starmer, he's facing defections and no confidence rumblings. It isn't that the system makes it too easy to challenge leaders, it's that his parliamentary majority was always a fiction. People voted Labour actually because they wanted the Tories out, and other parties offer more authentic alternatives for voters, as much as we might despise what they really stand for in some ways. And now terrified MPs are becoming disloyal MPs. So Britain is stuck in this worst of both worlds, European style fragmentation with this Westminster system designed to deny it exists. And we're all getting more impatient because social media has affected our attention spans. And the Green and Reform, they reflect this siloed algorithm. Um, so there is a lot of unrest, and the only way to solve it is to actually look at the system and see if it's fit for purpose. And I do not see that happening anytime soon. We clearly need some aspects of proportional representation, perhaps. And I don't know how it can be worked. No one's really actually spoken about it. That's how bad it is. People aren't even thinking about how this would work in the real world, despite the problems bearing down on us in such a big way. And there's no obvious answer.
I'm going to ask you one more question, but before I do that, I just wanted to let everybody know we have a few more questions. We're not going to be able to get to you. I'm sorry. If you'd like to contact me, I'd be more than happy to answer if I can, or forward it to Alex, who perhaps would be kind enough to respond. If you'd like, want to let you know next week is Memorial Day, so we won't be having a briefing. We will be having a briefing on June 1st, and we're going to have Austrian MEP Lucas Mandel speak to us on that day. So let's end with this. It's been not your fault, you're just the messenger, but a very discouraging conversation. And I hope we have a follow-up conversation that perhaps leads to more hopeful discussion in the future. But with that in mind, is there something you are optimistic about? I mean, you do what you do because inherently you must be optimistic. You must see a reason for continuing to do what you do. Share, if you can.
I do see that the political will has finally started to kick in. I do feel that societally, people are beginning to speak up more. After Golders Green, I had to strap on a stab-proof vest and stand outside the synagogue. And a passerby said to me, there is more support for you than you know, and everyone feels very sympathetic about what's going on to the Jewish community. So there are signs of life there. It depends what happens to it, politically and socially, how this is treated, whether things become normalized. How normalized has it become? What's happened? When there's so many stories of violence day in, day out, it's not good because it just becomes kind of normal in people's eyes. So we're at this very dangerous place. But on the other hand, we've started seeing the police cracking down. We're starting to see prosecutions after everything that's happened since the threat grew to severe. So there are some signs of optimism, and I will keep fighting for a place for a Jewish community, regardless of what happens. And there are people like me who say, you know what, without Jews, this Britain is not our Britain. It's not the Britain that we know, the Britain that we love. And those are the people that we really need to be appealing to and talking to as well.
I don't want to assume, so I'll ask. Did King Charles visiting Golders Green and then offering a pretty resounding um, rebuke of anti-Semitism in his King's speech, is that reason for optimism?
Yeah, this massive, huge figure that everyone respects so much speaking up was a massive deal. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It meant a huge amount to the community, and the fact that he came out and said it so resoundingly without any kind of throat clearing, it's just straight support, and that's what we needed. And it was hugely appreciated and comforting, I would say, to the community because there's no higher figure in Britain than the king.
Yeah, indeed. Well, Alex, it's been a pleasure meeting you virtually and speaking with you. You've given everybody a great perspective on what you're dealing with and other Jews and Britons are dealing, or Britons are dealing with. So thank you for joining us, and we'll keep in touch.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
All right, everybody, go about your day and have a good one. Thanks for joining us.